Hey guys, this is Miss Chang bringing to you part one of session eight's lesson, the carbon cycle. Really excited about this presentation. I spent way too much time on it, but I hope you enjoy. I think it's very informative, and then the activity for session eight was really fun. So our agenda is that you're going to be watching parts one and two of session eight's carbon cycle lesson. So part one, which is what you're watching right now, will focus more on the carbon within the four spheres and how it's stored. And in part two is about the actual biogeochemical cycles that cycles carbon through the four spheres. If you would like, you could review the carbon cycle presentation just so you could look at more of the figures and so on, or rewatch some of the videos. And then our assignment, our graded assignment for this week, is for you to complete and turn in our carbon cycle poster assignment by this upcoming Sunday, 5:31. All right, so our learning objectives for this unit is number one, climate change can occur when certain parts of Earth's systems are altered. Changes in the atmosphere due to human activity have increased carbon dioxide concentration and thus affect climate. Number two, climate change can occur when certain parts of Earth's systems are altered. Changes in the atmosphere due to human activity have increased carbon dioxide concentrations and thus affect climate. And number three, gradual atmospheric changes were due to plants and other organisms that captured carbon dioxide and released oxygen. All right, so let's just do a little overview here. So we want to know how much carbon is on the Earth and what exactly is the carbon cycle. So first, carbon is an essential nutrient found in all living things. The molecules that make up living things are called organic compounds. So any type of compound within your body that has carbon in it is called an organic compound. You might hear it as an organic molecule. So carbon exists in living things as organic compounds. So the carbon cycle itself refers to how carbon moves through the four spheres on Earth and fluctuates between the spheres. So each sphere contains a different amount of carbon stored in various factors known as carbon reservoirs. So the amount of carbon on Earth is fixed or constant due to the law of conservation of matter. There's only a finite amount of carbon, but then it can fluctuate. And then the fluctuations are brought about by biogeochemical cycles. These are processes that transfer carbons between carbon reservoirs. So we want to make sure we have our units down first. So we're going to refer to a unit's GTC, and that refers to gigatons of carbon. And the reason why we do it is because there's a lot of carbon on Earth, and 1 gigaton refers to 1 billion tons. So, and then the rate of carbon transfer is going to be in gigatons per year. And then just an overall view, the Earth has over 1.85 billion gigatons of carbon. That's the equivalent of 1.85 times 10 to the 18th tons of carbon. That's in scientific notation. But in standard notation, it is, I can't even read this, 1,850,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 tons of carbon. Don't even know what place value that is because it's just beyond what normal people count. There's a lot of carbon here. And then over 99% of it is stored in Earth's crust within the geosphere, and most of that does not cycle because of the fact that it's just covered up, it just sits there, and it just chills out, which is really good so that we can't screw up the carbon cycle too much because there's a lot of carbon that just doesn't do anything. All right, carbon sinks and sources. So as we mentioned before, carbon fluctuates on Earth, and then it depends on whether one process absorbs more carbon or maybe releases more carbons. So when we refer to the term carbon sinks, these refer to factors that remove more carbon from the atmosphere than they release. So if you look at this picture right here, we have the ocean sink as well as the land sink. So these are our two major carbon sinks on Earth, meaning that these two guys, the ocean as well as the vegetation on land, absorb a lot of carbon from the atmospheres and help reduce the amount of CO2, so it slows down climate change. So the carbon reservoir specifically refer to the factors that store carbon. So you would call the ocean a carbon reservoir, vegetation a carbon reservoir, geological reservoirs include your fossil fuels, and so on. The process of removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it elsewhere is known as carbon sequestration. So you might hear that in other classes. And then last but not least, carbon sources, on the other hand, are factors that release more carbon into the atmosphere than they remove. Go ahead and look at carbon reservoirs in the four spheres. So the first sphere that we're going to discuss is the biosphere. So where is all the carbon in the biosphere? And just a reminder from our four spheres lessons, the biosphere refers to all living things on Earth. So the first part is that there's 550 gigatons of carbon found within the biosphere. So gigatons, once again, refers to billions of tons, so 550 billion tons of carbon within the biosphere, which is a lot of carbon. However, this is actually one of the smallest measurements of all the four spheres. There's a lot more carbon elsewhere. Next, the carbon that is stored within the biosphere is referred to as biomass. Biomass refers to energy-rich organic compounds such as glucose produced by photosynthetic organisms. Also includes things like nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids, everything you see in that bottom left-hand corner. These biological organic molecules that make our DNA, that make our muscles, the cells, as well as the sugar we eat, cellulose, which is the cell structure, important component of cell structures. All of that contains carbon, and that's what an organic compound means. It's a molecule that contains carbon. Next up is that most of Earth's biomass is found in producers such as trees. So this goes back to biology. We're talking about trophic levels, and you had the energy pyramid, where at the very bottom of the energy pyramid, you had the most producers. So producers are anything that undergoes photosynthesis to make its own food. You might remember that as being called a autotroph. So plants have the most biomass. So it's all within the trees, the grass, the ferns, all of that is the majority of the biomass. Then as you go up the different trophic levels, there's going to be less and less biomass. So if you look here on this picture, the only little red square is only 2.5 gigatons is actually within animals that we think of. And there's actually a lot more biomass found in bacteria that is on us as well as in the soil than there is on humans. Next up, forests are carbon sinks. So because of the fact that plants undergo photosynthesis, they actually take up more carbon than they release. So they're going to absorb a lot of the atmospheric carbon and help moderate climate change so it doesn't happen as much, keep the CO2 levels low. And then respiration and photosynthesis are two key cycles that cycles carbon in and out of the biosphere. So those two are the most important for the biosphere. So next up, we're going to talk about carbon within the atmosphere. So we have a picture of the greenhouse effect on the right. That was last week's lesson. So that one actually has 800 gigatons of carbon. So it actually has more carbon in the atmosphere than we do have in all the living things on Earth. So carbon is stored primarily as carbon dioxide, CO2, which is a greenhouse gas responsible for regulating temperature on Earth. So there's other forms of carbon compounds in the air, such as methane, which is CH4, but the majority of it is CO2. And actually, it's a really small amount. So I believe it's 0.2% of the atmosphere is made out of carbon, but somehow that 0.2 is enough to be 800 gigatons, which is more than what's in the biosphere. And then respiration and photosynthesis are biogenic carbon cycles within the atmosphere. So once again, biogenic means that these are natural occurring carbon cycles, and it goes hand in hand with what's going on with the biosphere. So they have a key relationship cycling carbon between the two. However, anthropogenic carbon sources, including land change, use, land use change as well as combustion. So we're going to talk more about that towards the end of our presentation in part 2. But anthropogenic means man-made or human-made carbon sources. And these sources have been disrupting the natural biogenic carbon cycle. Next up is going to be carbon in the hydrosphere. So this is within your oceans. So we actually break it down into different parts of the ocean. So the surface ocean, where you have photosynthesis, has 1,000 gigatons of carbon. However, the deep ocean has 37,000 gigatons of ocean. So that is significantly more carbon within the oceans. So the total amount of carbon within the hydrosphere is about 38,000 gigatons of carbon. So there's about 50 times more carbon within the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. So the carbon that is stored in the ocean is going to be dissolved carbon dioxide, CO2. But remember when we talked about ocean acidification last week, that when CO2 dissolves, it forms carbonic acid, and then that could dissociate to form bicarbonate, which is HCO3, and then carbonate, which is CO3 negative 2 charge. And then the process that cycles carbon in and out of the ocean is the air-sea gas exchange. So that works hand in hand with the atmosphere. We'll go more into that in a later slide. And then the world's oceans are a carbon sink, reducing atmospheric CO2 levels and holds 50 times more carbon than the atmosphere. So the ocean is a very valuable, critical part of maintaining low CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So it is preventing global warming from happening very quickly, despite how much carbon that we are spewing into the atmosphere. However, as we talked about with ocean acidification, that as we add more CO2 into the hydrosphere, that can lead to some repercussions such as lower pH, higher acidity, and higher acidity prevents shellfish as well as coral from forming their shells, and then their numbers are going down. All right, last but not least, we have carbon in the geosphere. So we do have a short little video for you to watch while we are on this slide, but let's go over the figures. So the first part is that in the geosphere, you have the soil, which has 2,300 gigatons of carbon. Sediments, which is at the bottom of the oceans, but it's formed from weathered as well as dead organic matter, weathered rocks, dead organic matter. And then fossil fuels has 10,000 gigatons of carbon for a total of 18,300 gigatons per year. So do know, we did mention earlier that the majority of carbon is in the geosphere, but then didn't I just tell you that there's 38,000 gigatons of carbon within the hydrosphere? And this is just to say that 18,300 gigatons represents the amount of carbon that is cycled within the geosphere. So most of the carbon is not cycled. Thankfully, it's stored in rocks and it stays as rocks, such as your limestone cliffs and so on, and marble. So carbon is stored in soil and sediment and rocks such as limestone. So limestone is made out of calcium carbonate, as well as fossil fuels such as coal, oil, natural gas, etc. And in death and decomposition within the biosphere, sedimentation and rock formation cycles carbons in and out of the geosphere. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
So why are fossil fuels such a powerful but ultimately problematic source of energy? Conditions on the waterways of today's Louisiana help us understand how fossil fuels are made and why they're ultimately unsustainable. Oil, coal, and natural gas are made from things, mostly plants, that lived and died long ago. It's taken hundreds of millions of years for nature to create enough of the special conditions that save the carbon and energy in plants to form the fossil fuels that we use. Here's how it works. Plants, like these tiny diatoms encased in silica shells, grow in the upper layers of lakes and oceans, using the sun's energy to turn carbon dioxide and water into more plants. When they die, if they're buried where there's little oxygen to break them down, their chemical bonds retain the energy that began as sunlight. If enough carbon-rich matter is buried deeply enough, for long enough, the Earth's heat and pressure turn it into fossil fuel, concentrating the energy that once fed the growing plants. Vary what goes into Earth's pressure cooker and the temperature, and you end up with the different kinds of fossil fuel. Woody plants make coal. Slimy plants, algae, will give you oil, and both of them give rise to natural gas. The fossil fuels formed over a few 100 million years, and we're burning them over a few 100 years. And if we keep doing that, sooner or later they must run out. But there's a bigger problem with fossil fuels. As we've seen, they're made of carbon primarily. When you burn them, you add oxygen, and that makes CO2 that goes in the air. We're reversing the process by which they formed. And if we keep doing this, it must change the composition of Earth's atmosphere.